Good evening, everybody. I think we're going to get this started. This is a lot more people than I expected, so yay. Thank you for coming out. My name is Willie Docto. I have lived in Duxbury since 1996 when I moved up here from Washington, D.C. with my husband, Greg Schulson. Been very, very happy to be living in Vermont and in Duxbury and the Mad River Valley area. So I'm very honored that Representative Torre asked me to moderate. I did this on a whim last January, and I guess I did a good enough job that she invited me back, so thank you. We are going to use microphones because this is going to be recorded by the Mad River TV. So at the end of our panel discussion, we will have an opportunity to have a question and answer session. So when you have a question or a comment, I will come to you, or if you could come closer to the mic because it is wired. That way we'll be heard by those watching us on social media or YouTube or wherever. So, okay. And this microphone, unfortunately, I cannot turn off. So we're going to hope that it continues to work. Okay, so welcome. This is an opportunity for us to come together as a community and engage in a meaningful conversation with our local elected officials. What you read or see in the media doesn't always provide a full picture, nor the nuance of the challenges of our government officials and what they tackle daily. This is why our local legislators are here to meet you, their constituents, so that you have an opportunity to hear from them directly and from them to hear from you. That is, I'm confident that this will be a productive and insightful discussion. Our panelists have not only a wealth of expertise, but also the ability to affect change in Montpelier. They're the people we trust to work on Vermont's workforce needs, climate funding, the environment, flood recovery and resilience, education funding, housing, public safety, appropriations, agriculture, and more. They'll each have an opportunity to introduce themselves, but I just want to take a moment now to welcome them individually, so I'll just call out their names. We'll start with Senator Ann Cummings, Senator Andrew Perchlik, Senator Ann Watson, Representative Kari Dolan, and Representative Dara Torre. Our legislators are here tonight because they understand the importance of connecting with community members like you. They're committed to listening to your concerns, communicating progress and challenges, and helping to connect the dots on how issues are interrelated. As moderator, I'll do my best to manage diverse perspectives and ensure that we have a fruitful dialogue. While opinions of one person may differ from another person, I encourage you to keep the discussion focused on issues and avoid personal remarks. Remember, we're all here to inquire, learn, listen, and share solutions. The agenda will be as follows. First, I'm going to ask each legislator to introduce themselves, their committee assignments, and more importantly, what they see as their top 1 or 2 achievements this session. Then I will ask them some more specific questions related to bills that were passed, vetoed, or overruled. Then we'll provide you an opportunity to ask questions until about 6:30. We will try to cover as many topics as possible, so to ensure a productive conversation, I kindly request the audience to prepare your questions so that it is succinct and to the point. I'm sure we'll run out of time before we run out of things to talk about. So let's get started. Okay, so this past week, if you've been reading the news, and I'm sure you all have, the big news was about the supermajority legislature overriding 6 of Governor Scott's 8 vetoes. We will get into some more specific issues and bills later, but let's warm up first. I'd like to ask each of you to discuss, I'd like to start this discussion by asking each of you about the bills that did pass and were signed into law by the governor. So let's start with Senator Cummings. If you could just remind us your name and the committees that you serve in, and if you could give us one or two highlights of what you felt you achieved this session.
Okay. I'm Ann Cummings. I'm the old timer here. If you don't remember the last election, we had a third of both houses in the legislature turnover. So we have a lot of new people. By the time we go back in January with the deaths and the retirements we've had in the Senate, half the Senate will be new. It takes a while to learn how to work with others and to be productive, and it's been a challenging year. I will say I've been there, I think, over 28 years maybe, since '97. This is the hardest year, or most frustrating year I think I've been through. I chair the Finance Committee. We do taxes and insurance and banking, but taxes this year. And I'm on Housing and Economic Development. And I think all of our big bills got vetoed. The housing bill was vetoed. It was overridden, but we are really working at finding a balance between protecting the environment and making it easier and less costly for people to build housing. We put $800 million of federal funds during COVID into housing. It's just taking a while to get all of it out of the ground. We did a data privacy bill, which was vetoed and was not overridden, but the commitment is, the Senate didn't have time. Some of us just didn't feel that we knew what we were doing, and I think we all want to do a data privacy bill so that your information is protected, but we want to make sure that we do it right and we don't cause more problems. So that one is out there. My committee did the yield bill, such as it was. That bill, usually it sets the yield, how much a penny on the tax rate will raise. It seldom goes at its own bill. It usually gets attached to the budget or the miscellaneous tax bill. It's pretty pro forma. I don't think I have to tell you this year it wasn't pro forma. It's a very difficult year, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that some more, but that was at least my big fight of the session.
Thank you, Senator Perchlik, if you wouldn't mind. And do include bills that you did pass. Yeah. We'll get into the veto stuff as well. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Willie, and thank everybody for coming. It's great to have people coming out on a Friday to talk about the legislative session. I'm Andrew Perchlik. I'm on the Transportation Committee and on the Appropriations Committee. I'll think of two bills that I wanted to highlight, or just two efforts more, because in the appropriation you just do one bill, the budget, and basically. And in the appropriations, I really worked on supporting our communities for flood relief. So worked as the point person on providing money for FEMA match to the towns, direct money for the towns, it was just like a cash payment, which I don't know if those have actually gone out yet, but basically all the towns in the county, because they all had flood damage, will get a check. Some towns like Barry are going to get $1 million, $750,000 to Montpelier, and then lesser amounts to the smaller towns. Money for houses to be raised so that we don't lose those houses permanently to FEMA buyouts. Also money for businesses to recover from the flood. So that's kind of where my focus was on appropriations. And I'm only on my first term in appropriations, so part of my success was just kind of learning how the Appropriations Committee works and how to be an effective advocate in that committee for the Washington District. I'm on transportation. I worked on a lot of small things. One of the things that I liked and kind of proud of is we worked a lot on the rotor rust, which I remember in the Valley was an issue. I remember I got a lot of emails a couple of years ago that people that were not passing inspections because their rotors were rusty and they were forced to, spend $1,200, $800 to get them, fixed. And so we changed the kind of the way the inspection stations are looking at rust, and hopefully we won't have unnecessary expenses when your rotors aren't really dangerous. There's not a lessening of the braking. So that was a small thing, but I think everybody needs their car inspected. So if we can improve the way people are getting through DMV is important. Worked a lot on bike and ped. How do we make things safer for pedestrians, which I know is an issue that your representatives have worked on with the accident we had here in town. So I think that's an important thing that we can do a lot more on, and that the committee's focused on, try to get more money and more planning around that. And also helped negotiate a new fee for electric vehicles. It was a kind of a controversial issue with kind of becoming a partisan or political divide about which way you thought should EVs have fees. And was able to negotiate where both sides were supportive of a fee, but with the money going for charging stations for affordable multifamily housing. So that was something that I was proud of, because I thought it was an example of working across the aisle, working with people with different opinions, but coming up with a solution that worked for everybody. And it's a fee that the governor supported. So he says he doesn't support any fees or taxes, but that fee he liked, so he didn't complain about that one.
Great, thank you, Senator Perchlik. Senator Watson, would you like to go?
Sure. Yep, so Ann Watson, I am on the Natural Resources and Energy Committee as well as the Government Operations Committee. There were quite a few bills that I was proud to have a hand in or work on, or that just glad that we passed this session. One of them was the housing bill, which Senator Cummings already mentioned, so I'm going to leave that one for now. I'm happy to talk more about that or help explain how that worked. But another couple bills that I was really glad to have worked on. One was the Flood Safety Act, sort of similar to Senator Perchlik. The effects of the flooding were pretty top of mind going into this last session, and how are we going to help our communities respond? And so the Flood Safety Act addressed a variety of ways that we can hopefully be preventing similar flooding in the future. So everything from adding more funding for dam safety and changing the way dams are regulated in Vermont to be a little bit more robust, as well as shifting the responsibility for regulating river corridors from municipalities to the state. Municipalities were actually very grateful to have that shift happen, and then also some better work around wetland impacts. So if you're going to build in a wetland, what do you have to do to compensate for the lost, basically capacity for absorbing water. So that was all part of that bill. And then another one that I want to highlight was the Climate Superfund bill, which would require that the world's largest oil companies that have some nexus with Vermont pay for the damages that their pollution has caused as a result of climate change. So we know that we would have storms anyway, even in the absence of climate change, but they're that much worse because of climate change, and that increment is quantifiable. The amount of damage in terms of money is quantifiable, and so that is what we know these oil companies are responsible for. So based off of legislation that we've passed previously around responsibility of Saint-Gobain polluting in Bennington, this is a similar idea. If you make a mess, if you pollute, and it causes damage to a community, then this applies a strict liability so that those companies are responsible for paying for that damage. So both of those two bills that I just mentioned, the Flood Safety Act and the Climate Superfund, were bills that the governor allowed to go into law without his signature, but he didn't veto them. So really very grateful for that and all the work, all the legislators that were involved in making those two bills happen.
Great, thank you. Let's go with Representative Torre, because we'll leave Representative Dolan to speak last, okay?
Okay. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. So I'm on the Environment and Energy Committee, and this is my first term. So this was the second year of my first term. And I think for me, the highlights were picking up work that we started last year and then really bringing it across the line. So there were two really important bills that you've heard of, I'm sure. One is it's H687, it's the Act 250 modernization bill, that's also the housing bill. And that was kind of kicked off last year. I mean, years and years of work have gone into Act 250 reform. But what happened last summer that was special was a big working group got put together that was made up of very diverse stakeholders, including, business interests, environmentalists, planners, and it was facilitated. Really good consensus agreements came out of that because, as we know, Act 250 has been controversial and land use is complicated. So we had something to work with from that working group. At the same time, two other working groups met, working on planning in general. So we've got our local planning commissions, we've got our regional planning commissions, and we realized that key to land use is planning, right? Before you can have a land use conflict, or to minimize land use conflicts, you have good planning, right? And the community gets engaged in that planning. So this effort to really look at how can we grow smarter and safer in Vermont, brought together the planning community, and they had some wonderful, great ideas that we were able to incorporate along with the Act 250 modernization piece. And then at the same time, and I mean, many of us may know that we have designated downtowns and designated village centers that get certain treatment and grant opportunities. And that whole issue of designation is also updated in the same vein of, are we incentivizing the right growth in the right places? So the highlight for me was getting to take all of that together in this big, ambitious bill, really work together, lots of input, lots of compromise. Then we sent it downstairs, and all the housing pieces got added to it. And the other compromise, consensus-type building work that happened last summer was the Renewable Energy Working Group. They put together, it was utilities, all the utilities in Vermont, environmental groups, housing agency representation, coming together to look at updating our renewable energy standard, which is basically our blueprint for our utilities, helping them decide or reach clean energy goals. So for how much hydro, how much renewables need to be part of their portfolio. And that's all to help Vermonters have reliable, cost-effective, clean electric sources. So that work happened, and we got to work off of that. We got some model legislation that we got to, work through, revise, and both of those bills were vetoed. But I do want to just emphasize that there was a lot of compromise that went into them. So I hope people don't have the impression that just because a bill's vetoed, it means it wasn't bipartisan or of interest to different types of legislators, and spans different sessions. I mean, the work that we picked up this session was started long ago. So those are highlights for me.
So it's nice to hear the words compromise and consensus. We don't often hear that, especially in federal government. This was your first term, and we have Representative Dolan, who is leaving after several terms. So I'd like to offer you a few more minutes than everybody else to speak about not just this year, but your accomplishments for during your tenure.
Well, thank you I'm Kari Dolan, and the several years is really 3 terms, but it sometimes does feel like several more years than that. I've been just really proud to be the representative for our district and really made a priority at being available to you all, to the public, to our constituents, to our neighbors, our friends, our businesses, concerned citizens, and to hear about what your priorities are. And I think we've worked very closely, certainly across this, our senators and with Representative Torre, to be available. And I have to say that I truly appreciate folks reaching out to us and describing their concerns, because we are only as good as being able to reflect your interests and concerns. So I wanted to mention how important it is, being a citizen legislature, to be available and have that kind of dialogue with you all. I would say, I've served for 2 terms on the Natural Resources Committee, and then the last 2 years, the last term, on the Appropriations Committee. And while Senator Perchlik said it's about the budget, it's huge. It's a huge issue. We are one of only a few states that does not mandate a requirement to balance a budget, and we do that every year. That's a lot of work to come up with a balanced budget, given that all demands. Then we have flooding we need to address, and being able to leverage state dollars to match federal dollars to assist us in that recovery. And so that takes a substantial amount of work. We have public meetings, public hearings, we take testimony, and we work across the board. Our committee is made up of members from both of the major parties, the Republicans and Democrats, and we work incredibly well together. And I have to say that this budget this year passed with overwhelming support. Bipartisan support was signed by the governor. That reflects that kind of collaboration that occurs in Vermont. We've talked about vetoes, and we talk about some of these bills that are really difficult, because being a citizen legislature, being in session for only 3.5 months a year, and then certainly being available as throughout the year as the representatives and senators, there's an awful lot of work that goes into trying to be as effective and helpful as we can across all subject matters, from transportation to environment to commerce to public health to justice issues, judiciary issues, and the like. And so to actually arrive at a balanced budget is a substantial amount of work, and something I'm incredibly proud of. Then you add on top of that a flood event at the magnitude that we experienced almost a year ago, and that was $1 billion price tag. Did you know that the Tropical Storm Irene, which affected some 90% of the state, was less in terms of dollars than that amount? I think it was around $700 million. Maybe if you added in the time value of money, it would approach closer to that $1 billion price tag, but that's substantial. But then we had flooding in Addison County in September, and more flooding in December. And I think we sometimes have commented about flood amnesia. We don't forget about it, because we're in a district that experiences substantial flooding unfortunately on a more frequent basis. But to have this front and center to everyone across the state, including the governor, is why we made this a priority on how to help our businesses. You can just imagine the disruption that these flood events had caused our communities, our emergency services, our businesses. And so to be able to be right there with our with support that we can then leverage federal dollars was important. And that became a priority. I was a little bit of a thorn in the side, at least on the House side, to ensure that we were in support of the governor's interest, that we were going to leverage as much federal dollars as possible to be able to do flood recovery and build long-term resilience in our communities. And we were able to accomplish that in the budget. And so I want to just emphasize how critically important the budget was. The other thing I'm really proud of is that when you look under the hood of what that budget is made up of, you learn an awful lot. And what we learned firsthand, and we'll get to this whole issue about education spending and the need for reform, is that when we discovered there's some cost shifts that occur occasionally from one sector to another. When you underfund the very services that are delivering mental health services, services for aging Vermonters, services for people with disabilities or developmental disabilities, when you underserve that, because we outsource all that action, all that activity in out-of-state government, when you don't provide, say, cost of living increases, what happens? You get a cost shift away from the general fund to whatever fund is available to be the last resort to deliver those services. And in some cases, it ended up being on the education fund. And so I worked doggedly to try to restore a cost of living increase for our social services, for people with disabilities, for aging, and for independent living recipients, so that we can not only provide those services, but minimize and avoid that kind of cost shifting moving forward. And that's something I'm really proud of, on something that we know is going to be extremely beneficial. Related to that, I'm thrilled because for the first time ever, we added to statute making adults with developmental disabilities an eligible category for state-assisted housing. First time ever. And that was the work that we did closely with the administration and certainly with the Senate to get that accomplished. And I'm really proud of that as well. Now, being at one time, prior to joining the legislature, I was the state floodplain manager and often had to deal with the aftermath of flooding. And the two bills that we mentioned here and the budget itself, the public safety, flood safety bill, as well as that resilience bill, did two important things that we never had before in the past. What we've done in the past is when we get a flood event, we immediately try to recreate whatever we had in response to the last flood event. This time we're doing something smarter and different and more long-term. We're looking at flood resilience to make us stronger and more resilient to that future funding, but we're also enabling ourselves to be able to quickly respond to flood events and recover from those events. And that's what those two bills do. And that is something that is going to really show a huge benefit to the public as we move forward to next year's set of weather-related events that we're likely to experience. We are going to be that much better prepared from the two bills, that one the governor signed and the second that he let go into law. But let me tell you a little bit behind the scenes on the one that he didn't sign but went into law. I worked behind the scenes on that bill. I've been working on those two bills for my full 6 years here. And I worked behind the scenes with the administration to say, how do we get these over the finish line? Because we need to do response, recovery, resilience all together. And they said, okay, this is what we need to do. The bill needs to look like one of those bills that came forward. And lo and behold, the governor let that one become part of become law. And I think that reflects what Vermont's all about. That collaboration, that working together, that partnership. And gosh, you know, I used to sort of joke, maybe they had this joke as well. I used to joke, do we really need a Senate? And I'm sure they used to say, do we really need a House of Representatives? Oh gosh, we really needed each other this year, because they became so important to, again, expand how and who we listen to, invite people to testify, listen to all sides, and work together for the common interest of Vermont. And I have to say, don't judge the legislature by those few vetoes. Recognize the substantial amount of work for a citizen legislature, what we are able to do together, and what we can do in terms of moving forward, moving the state of Vermont forward.
Great, thank you very much. You've all touched on some really complex issues, but I think we in the room, I think that the general feeling that the major issue that we really want to talk about tonight is, and we'll touch on others, is the property tax. So early on, it was estimated that the property tax would increase by 18% or more. School districts went and voted whether to approve their budgets or not. A lot of school districts did not. And they lowered their budgets in order for them to pass. I think there's only 2 districts left that have not passed their budgets. The yield bill that you did overrule brings that increase down to 13.8%. That is still substantial. My question around that is 2, actually. One, what would have happened if the veto had been sustained? And 2, now that we have it, what are the programs that homeowners can take advantage of for assistance?
That's mine. Yeah. Usually school spending goes up 4% a year. This year went up between 18 and 20%, but it has been increasing all during the COVID years. And that may be partly our fault because of the federal stimulus, all the sales tax money goes to the Ed Fund, and because there was that federal stimulus, the Ed Fund got $20 million more for those 3 years, actually 4, than it would have if we had been with the old transfer from the general fund formula. So a lot more money going in. Before the December 1st letter came out, and the tax department, the education department, and our joint fiscal office, which is a nonpartisan, they crunch numbers for everybody, they all get together and they talk to the schools. Once they hear what the superintendents and the business managers are going to be proposing, they, by law, have to figure out all the available funds in the Ed Fund. And they say, okay, if these budgets pass, you're looking at X. When they did that letter, there was $30 million in the Ed Fund that had come in between the time we went home and the money that was in and the forecasted money by our economists. And we have a very rigid system where you have to stick to the forecasted money because we got into trouble by not doing that before and saying, oh, we'll have more money, so we'll spend it. So there was already $30 million in there. And that's when the word came out that school spending was going up. It was going up, and if you did, you were going to see an increase of 18%. We spent a lot of time trying to get the word out to schools. The House had done, when we did the waiting bill the year before, the Senate said any town that lost on taxing capacity because you didn't have the number of generally low-income students or English as a second language, but what most towns lost were low-income students. You're going to absorb a fifth of that every year, you know, for 5 years. And the House wanted to do it immediately, so they said, well, at this time, school spending wasn't going up at 4%. So they said, well, it can't go up more than 5%. And if it goes up 10, then you have to come into some committee and explain it. So an awful lot of schools seem to be saying, well, we can spend 9.9% increase in our spending, and our taxes are held at 5%, and this is really cool. And a lot of them did that. Once we figured out that was going on, we spent probably the first month, 6 weeks in the legislature trying to get the word out to schools that, no, we're changing that. I mean, that's a formula for bankruptcy. You can't limit your income to 5 and allow yourself to spend at 9.9, or you go bankrupt. And that took a lot of focus. And yield bills, these are all revenue bills, and by the Constitution, revenue bills have to start in the House. The House had the yield bill for 10 weeks. My committee had it for 10 days if you count weekends, and most of those days, because it was in the end of the session, we were on the Senate floor until 5 o'clock at night. So we did a lot of work into the evening, but we were really constrained on time. This was a year in which there were no easy answers. We raised money to balance the budget. We did that early on. This is the first year I've always joked that no one lets me do my job. They never let me raise taxes. This year, they let me do my job, if that's how you think of it. We raised some insurance fees in the Department of Financial Regulation, which is mostly insurance companies pay those, in order to balance the budget and be able to give those community-based services at least something to cover the inflationary costs that they have. They have to pay people just like the schools and the state does, and those people got mostly 6 to 7%. State, I got 6 the first year and something similar, I think 4 or 5 the second. So we did that, and that way you could balance the budget. Then we had the yield bill. If the yield bill had not been overridden, and I see Dara's got the Joint Fiscal Office sheet, so I'm working from memory. If we had let it ride, and I was kind of afraid the governor, it might do that, because it would have lowered residential property taxes 3 and 4%. It would have lowered them. 13 and 11% if you pay based on income or you just pay. But your non-residential, which are all your apartment buildings and your second homes and businesses, they would have gone up 30%. And the Ed Fund would have been left with, I believe, a $63 million deficit next year, which means we would have to come up with $63 million in property tax revenue, or more sales tax, which we don't have a lot of control over, to start. And nobody thinks that school spending is going down next year. So we try not, it takes approximately $12 million in spending or in savings, but it's $12 million to move a penny on the tax rate. So, you know, we'd have to come up with 3-4 cents starting out if we ran into a deficit. We raised, in the effort to try and buy it down, we raised $27 million in new taxes. I don't think anybody felt really good about how we did that. We taxed the cloud, which is cloud-based services. The example is TurboTax. You used to buy it in a box, and you had a floppy disk, and you put it in your machine, and you paid a sales tax. Then you got a card when you bought the computer, and you logged on to a site, and they downloaded TurboTax onto your machine. Now you go into the cloud, you pay a fee, you use TurboTax in the cloud, and you don't pay any fee. The argument has always been you are purchasing something, and therefore you should pay a fee. We've looked at this. The House has passed it at least three times. The Senate never has. But we are now up to about half the states have done this, so we're not out there. We have some experience. We did the most limited job we could do. Again, we were operating in like 4 days to do that. So we did a much more limited version, hoping because the tech field has grown exponentially since TurboTax in the cloud was brand new. Now these businesses one computer talks to another computer, and they use this program on that computer, and we're concerned. But we felt the need to come up with the money. We also put a 4% surcharge on the rooms and meals tax for Airbnbs. Again, not something that we wanted to do, but we looked at raising everyone a lesser amount. That would have made us the highest in New England. The wedding industry right here in the valley came to talk to us and said, that'll kill us. All I can tell you is we looked at every alternative we could find trying to raise some money to bring down the property tax. I think it was probably the most frustrating year I've had, because my committee tried to get bill came to us with a commission on the future of public education in it. We felt that the need was much more urgent, that we needed to do a task force, a much smaller group that would work on the base problem. Why? I don't personally think our schools are, doing an Ivy League level of education. I think they are struggling and they are doing a good job. But we are the highest per pupil cost in the country. We are off the charts in the number of adults to student ratio in the country. At the beginning of the session, halfway through, there were a group of us meeting after hours with the tax department and the education department and trying to figure out what can we do to the funding system. We are unique in the nation. We are the only state that has the amount of local control over school spending. In most other states, the state gives you, it's a foundation formula. The state, and the courts have said the state has to provide an adequate amount, and the fight is over what's an adequate amount. Wyoming was just taken to court for being inadequate. We're the only place where local voters decide how much they're going to spend. And trust me, it drives the legislature crazy, because when the Appropriations Committee says to X state department, I'm sorry, you may need 15%, but we've only got 5 this year. The governor signs a contract with employees, and the departments can be told to eat the pay act. You've got to come up with that money, figure out what you're going to reduce in your department to cover it. The schools are the only place where voters vote what they want to spend, and the state must. Well, we do 2 things. We take all the dedicated state revenue, which at this point is all the sales tax, and that's been significant. It's rooms and meals. There's part of the purchase and use. There's several other, all the lottery. We take everything we have, we subtract it out from the bill, and then we set the yield, we set the tax rate. That will raise the rest of the money. But we have no control over how much that is. We have to do what you tell us to do. Nobody else does that. This year, it's extreme. It's really extreme. I'm not sure how long I can absorb the increase. My husband and I are retired. I've heard from a lot of retired people. How long can I do that? We also, this year, when we raised money, money was dedicated so that people that pay based on income won't be hit, because your income payment this year normally would be based on your taxes and your income last year. Usually that varies by 1%, not much. This year, I believe the increase was 4 last year, so the people based on income, arguably the poorest, would have been hit with the full 18%. So we did take care of that. But I think my frustration was that the committee, we really wanted to work as a task force to come back with proposed legislation next year to try and do that. The House worked for months trying to figure out, we had a national expert, Larry Pikus, who is, he's worked with us before. He's nationally recognized in adequacy. Every state hires him. What is an adequate amount to provide a good education to kids? National standards, I was reading reports today, say your schools, your elementary schools, to be optimal, the bottom number is 300, the top is 5. If you believe in big schools, it's 5. Small schools are 3. I can't think of an elementary school in this area that has 300 kids. Maybe Barrytown or Barry City. I looked up yours. Nobody in the valley has anywhere near 300. And that is part of our, that's part of our cost problem. But doing anything about that, I chaired the education committee the year we did Act 48, and the valley did merge your school boards. But we still have, I think there's 5 elementary schools in the district. It's a very difficult conversation to have, but we are struggling to figure out, Pikus couldn't use national norms because we are so small. We are off the charts. And so when we did get some preliminary numbers, we wouldn't save a whole lot by going to an adequacy formula because we just have so many adults. So the commission is going to go forward. The task force got absorbed into the commission. How this is all going to work out, I don't know. Personally, I'm committed. I think, this year has set a new base. I don't think anyone thinks that without some kind of radical change in our system that we're going to be able to reduce costs. Because we have one school where the cost per student is $44,000 a year. Okay? You can do a pretty good private school education for $44,000 a year. We need to have that discussion. And it's a very painful discussion. But you can't do it in an 18-week legislative session. It has to be done with everybody involved.
Yeah, thank you very much, Senator Cummings. Your description really shows how complicated education funding is. What we see in the news, or we lay people, all we see is our taxes are going to go up by 13.8%, right? So the other part of my question was, are there assistance programs that, if any of you can remind us what there are? There's the income sensitive calculations, land use management programs. What else are there?
That's about it. In Vermont, renter's rebate, you can pay based on your income if you make less than $90,000 a year. And you are limited to a percentage of your income. But then if your town spends more than the state average, you don't get a free ride. If you spend more than the norm, you go up proportionately. But that does give a cushion. If you make less than $47,000 a year, you're limited in both state and local taxes to, I'm not going to quote, I think it's either 7 or 9% of your income. In the valley, local taxes probably aren't the issue. They are in places like Barry and Montpelier, where small cities, because they have fire, police, ambulance, have high local taxes. There is a renter's rebate program, which is much simplified. Basically, it's a rent subsidy. You don't have to have your landlord sign off on it anymore, and it's based on prevailing rent prices in your area. Current use is if you have 30 acres, 33, I think, because you can have your house in 3 acres, and then you can put, if you've got 30 more acres, into current use, and it is appraised at the value you're using it. Generally, it's agriculture or forestry. So if you have, there's requirements. You have to have a forest plan. You have to make 50% of your income in agriculture. But you can put it into current use, and the state does pay the town for the full value. That was a change that went in Act 60. Sometimes we did, and sometimes we didn't. But being able to pay based on income is the best we've been able to do. And then there are other things. Social Security isn't taxed if you are under, I think, the $90,000 cap. We don't tax most pensions if you make less than that. We've tried to float all boats up the same and trying to give some relief to people on fixed incomes. But we have a small tax base in this state. And I had a gentleman talking to me today. New York doesn't charge you property tax once you're retired. I'm retired. I'd love to do that. But at this point, anybody under 65, it probably, since 25% of our people are over 65, it would exponentially increase the taxes of everyone else, and we can't do that at this point. We aren't New York.
Okay, Representative Dolan, and Senator Perchlik.
I just was going to say that not everybody's tax it's an average, the 18%. So one of the questions people say, like, how could you let this pass? But there were some legislators whose districts' property taxes were going down. So they didn't have the same pressure. I think us here all represent districts where they were all going up. But when I talked to senators from Chittenden County, they're like, well, Winooski, the tax went down. So it wasn't the same feeling throughout the whole state. So that's just something to be aware of.
Thank you, Senators. As you can see, it's a very difficult issue. I wanted to comment on a couple of things that you had mentioned, the new revenue source of applying the sales tax to the cloud, and note that it was exempted years ago, thinking that no one would ever buy anything through the internet. And let's try to, oftentimes I was told that the legislature creates exceptions or exemptions to help foster the use of a new approach or technology. And then this one never had a sunset to that exception, so they just removed that exception. And that was at 3%, not 4%, so as I understand, in terms of that revenue applied to the short-term rental. But I did want to mention that the reason why and I wasn't on the Ways and Means, we have Finance Committee on the Senate side. The comparable tax-related committee is, in the House side, is the Ways and Means Committee. As I mentioned, on appropriations, which is about spending the revenues and allocating those dollars. The comparable Ways and Means committees took a substantial amount of time because they knew it was a different year. They knew that this wasn't simply going to be 3/4 of a single page yield bill where they set the tax rate. It was needing to be something more substantial. And they heard from over 100 entities, taking testimony, trying to get a better sense for what the options are. And it's really no fault of the own of our schools. They're delivering education to our kids. The most important focus on that is the quality of that education and doing as best a job as they can, given the circumstances. And you can just imagine when healthcare costs nationwide have been going up double digits every year, and when you have still responding and recovering from COVID with a substantial amount of mental health needs of our students, and the inflationary pressures in and of itself, not to mention the aging of our infrastructure. And what happens when we don't have an infrastructure, a dedicated infrastructure supports for our school system? Guess what? It goes onto the ed fund. And so with all those pressures on schools, that's why we have seen this jump. And we have, over the last couple of years, masked that pressure by using the general fund and add general funds to soften the blow onto the property tax. And so it wasn't until this year when we have no general funds to do that, except we did add $26 million of general funds. And we, on top of that, I think a total of, with one-time funding, up to about $90+ million to try to dampen the impact, to bring that potential average cost rate from that 18 to 19% to 13%. But next year, we may be in the same place. And so the only tool we have right now under our education finance system to actually react to a budget that is not affordable is to vote down a budget. And it's not fair for our kids, our schools, our teachers. We need better cost containment. What does that look like? We used to have some cost containment mechanisms in place, but that was all suspended during COVID and never reinstituted until this yield bill. So we needed to understand what are our options, how do we do cost containment, how do we address this, how do we avoid it for next year, and how do we get everyone to the table? Because as I mentioned, a citizen legislature with a 30-year bill, a 30-year act. Act 60 is 30 years old. We can't just throw it out and start anew in that short one term, or one semester, I call it, that one session. How do we really do this in a smart way? And it's really about having the governor at the table, having all the principals, the superintendents at the table, and really make sound decisions on how we're going to manage these costs. When the senator had mentioned about this task force and this commission, that's to do two things. That task force is to look at cost containment. And we needed to have that first and foremost, a subcommittee of that commission work to solely focus on how we're going to manage costs, to make it affordable, and have that continue with a focused effort. That commission is to then get everyone at the table and do a reform. It's going to take, though, political will, everyone at the table, and a lot of hard work and a commitment. And again, further emphasizing why it's so important for legislators to hear from you, because it's that kind of information we got from you all that made it certainly is the reason why every article I wrote in the Valley Reporter was on the education spending system. And what to raise awareness, to get you all to encourage that engagement, and to have you understand what we're struggling with here. And so this is certainly an issue that we need to work all together. You know, it was hard when our superintendents, our school districts rely on technical assistance, including financial assistance from the Agency of Education, but they didn't have a secretary for over a year. And they only provided some data to our superintendents, for our school districts, to do their budgeting very late in their school budgeting process. So we need to make sure we all need to work together on this issue collaboratively, because we all are paying those taxes. We're all not happy about paying those taxes, but we also all recognize how critically important it is to educate our kids the best way we can, and to support our schools and our teachers, and we got to do that all together.
Great, thank you. Before we move on to our next big topic, is there anyone else who wants to talk about education funding? Okay.
Yeah, thank you. One of the things that I heard Senator Cummings say was that, moving forward, we might need some radical change. And I'm so encouraged that there is this commission. That I'm hearing ideas from constituents about how we can do cost containment, how we can be honestly taxing Vermont's wealthiest residents, because the pain is not evenly distributed. There may be an opportunity to tax second homes at a higher rate if we can split out the non-homestead tax into its component parts and ask our wealthiest residents to pay a little more. But I think it is equally as important to consider the cost containment. And I say that as a teacher, and so that makes me a little nervous. What does it mean to contain costs? But it is clearly very a necessary part of the formula. And so, as I'm hearing from constituents about what do we do, how do we move forward, I've got a lot of ideas myself, the ideas that have sort of floated to the top. Do we shift it entirely to an income-based system? Or, are there other ideas to bring down the cost of healthcare, like reference-based pricing? There are options that are out there, and I guess I would just say this is a really high priority for me, to find solutions and being mentally prepared for whatever the outcomes are from this commission. Especially, if they are recommending a major shift, that is something that we need to really consider and do our homework on. But that I think where we have landed is obviously unsustainable, and so just anticipating that we may need to make a big shift to make it more workable for working and middle-class families.
Thank you. It is important for another group besides the legislature to focus on solutions that they can bring to the table. And it's very complicated, like you all have just described. So the next big topic I'd like to go into is housing, and then we'll go into question and answer. So we would be remiss if we didn't discuss housing, right? Availability, affordability, access to financing, labor shortages, and regulatory hurdles, just to name a few impediments. This week you overrode the veto of H687, which drastically reforms Act 250. So tell us how this law will solve our housing crisis, and how does it satisfy both the environmentalists and the developers?
I'm happy to take a first stab at this. This came through the Natural Resources and Energy Committee that I serve on. So there are both short-term solutions and long-term solutions that are baked into this bill. The long-term, one way to think about it is that Act 250 right now is threshold-based. If you build too fast or too densely, yeah, that's pretty much it, then you will trigger regulation. And if you build underneath that, then you might not trigger Act 250. So people talk about that, in places where the threshold is 10 houses, that you end up seeing all these clusters of 9 houses to avoid triggering Act 250. So what ends up happening there is we end up getting sprawl, and that in some places. And there are other places where maybe we have some very critical, fragile natural resources, where even building one house may be questionable, where that threshold is not capturing the delicacy of that place. And so what this bill does is it starts to transition from a threshold-based regulation to a location-based jurisdiction. So it's going to be very map-heavy. There are places where we know it makes sense to build. There's water, or there's sewer, or there's both, or there's soils that can absorb more drainage, places that are ripe for more housing or more development. And there are places that we know probably need more protections. And so there are, in the long term, there are going to be creating these maps. And there's going to be a lot of dialogue between the regional planning commissions and municipalities and individual landowners, as well as with Agency of Natural Resources, to ultimately come up with these maps. And it's going to be possible for places that meet certain thresholds, or I should say meet certain criteria, that they may be able to be fully exempt from Act 250 if they have really robust zoning. And there may be places that where the amount of regulation is actually a little bit stronger because they are fragile or critical natural resources. That part is just a framework. We did not define what the restrictions are. We've just said these places may exist, and that's going to be fleshed out over the next like 2 or 3 years. But the places that may see less regulation, they have to meet a threshold for their the robustness of their zoning, and then there's a tiered system to that. There's a level in which maybe you don't have enough zoning to meet the full exemption, but you may be able to be partially exempt from Act 250 based on the amount of zoning or infrastructure that you have. And so we anticipate that in a single town, you may have some places that that would be eligible to get the full exemption. There may be places where you can get partial exemption. There may be places where you have this sort of stronger regulation, all within the same municipality. So that's the long term. That's where we're headed. It's going to take at least 3 years, I think, to get there. In the meanwhile, there are some interim Act 250 exemptions for places that meet a list of criteria. And I think the criteria is like, that you have water or sewer or soils that can handle more drainage. Yeah, I think there's some more to that when I may let. Designated downtowns, and then there's like a radius around those designated downtowns, because we know a lot of our downtowns are in harm's way with flooding, and so we want to think about what is the radius around that area that maybe could be a little more flood-proof. So we know that Act 250 is not necessarily the only barrier to more housing in places, but it has been a barrier in some locations. And so this is meant to try to help remove that barrier and encourage more housing, especially uppercase affordable housing. Yeah.
So you can pass it down.
Yes.
So the governor was against this bill because he thought it favored environmentalists more. Is he correct?
I think it had a lot to do, well, there's concern about rural. There's the tiers that you mentioned. The biggest one is our small towns. And so there was a real concern that this regulation was going to put a stranglehold on communities that have a lot of mountainous terrain. What is it going to mean that, you can't develop your property? People had concerns like, what is this going to look like in my town? Are we going to just shrivel up? And so, in fact, that's a really important concern and question, and so there is going to be a study that really looks at what the smaller towns need, and that's, so, I think, I understand that was part of the concerns for some people and for the governor, but I feel like it was more those housing pieces and the funding for those housing pieces, namely taxes, that were the problem. I think that we got pretty good. We got pretty far on Act 250. We made some concessions about the legal piece with the court, whether it was going to be with the current system or if it was going to go back to the way it used to be. That was a concession that was made. So I just wanted to add that, the land use piece is the long haul, like it's going to make us build at the right places, but we have a short-term problem. We have the property tax increase problem, which is hard and immediate, And we have the housing problem that's keeping people from even living in your town, like your own relatives who can't come here, your children who have to leave. I think one of the things we've done in terms of planning that's good is made it easier for people who have a home to add an accessory dwelling, to add a mother-in-law apartment, to add a little separate structure on land you currently have to help house somebody. So what I'm hoping is that we can then get more programs that make it easier for homeowners to actually pull that off, both financially and that they feel safe being a landlord. And that takes some investment. We have current programs that are doing that have been funded in this bill. And I know our community is full of generous people who work together and have creative architectural ideas because of the kind of creative people that we have here. So my hope is that some of us will be able to tap into, adding some extra housing onto the land you already have, inviting someone into your home maybe through a home share. We have a wonderful state program for home sharing, and those could be ways to bring in some quick revenue to help you pay your property tax bill. And I think that that's really important. I just want to emphasize again for people that aren't here, just how many people may be qualified for an income sensitivity credit, either as a prebate or a rebate, and that they have time to do the necessary paperwork. It's not like you've missed the boat on that. And people can reach out to me for more information, to your town clerk. There's a, immediate need that we have to meet.
I want to give time to the audience, so if you could make 2 quick remarks, please. Yeah.
Really quick. I'm a retired realtor. One of the base problems we have is that it costs over $300,000 to produce a basic 2-bedroom ranch house. And the average Vermonter can afford $200,000 to $250,000. The private sector, with all the need, we're in market theory here. There's a need out there. The private sector has not come up. The housing we're building is perpetually affordable. That means perpetually subsidized. We are having difficulty with that basic 2-bedroom, 1-level ranch house that was your starter home or your retirement home. I've had a couple meltdowns because I have a 3-bedroom house and I'm still living in it. But there's no place for me to go. The ranch at the end of my street that was my ideal retirement home just sold for $460,000. That's out of the price range. So that's one problem. It's national. It's raw material cost, it's labor costs, and that's hitting us nationally. It's cost.
Thank you.
I did want to comment in addition to the remarks made about housing. Both the bill that you had referred to and the budget bill put substantial amount of resources into housing. In total, about $187 million to go through for a whole bunch of needs: housing construction and rehabilitation, emergency housing and shelter, supporting housing for recovery and transitional housing for refugees. So, and we have, in fact, won a very successful program called VHIP, which has a small amount of state dollars can bring a vacant or blighted property up to code to allow it to be rented on affordable rates. That was a substantial, continued substantial investment in housing itself. The other thing that we did in the budget last year or the year before is to use the federal dollars under COVID recovery, the ARPA funds, and there were categories of eligibility for those dollars that included housing and water, wastewater type of investments. And we are still being dogged about ensuring that those dollars are being put on the ground to help leverage existing funds to bring affordable housing units to the market. And we also recognize that when you have water and wastewater, your lot sizes can get smaller, and hence those properties can be more affordable. And also aids to the vitality of your communities for all sizes of communities. And this is why we're also investing in that water and wastewater, leveraging federal dollars to help support all sizes of communities, small to our medium-sized communities.
Thank you. I wish we had more time, and maybe the next time we do a panel discussion like this, we focus on one issue, housing. So if anyone would like to step up and ask a question, we invite you to do that. We'd love to hear from you. Any comments, questions? If you do, please talk to the microphone so the MRV TV can hear you. So, or we can repeat the question. Anyone? Lots of things going on today. Yes.
I have a couple of housing questions, housing related. All the money that you put into housing this year, about what percentage of total need do you think that will help address? That's one question. And the other is, and Senator Watson, you touched on, building in downtowns is flood, in many places is flood zone. So as much as you're allowing, looking at sort of the periphery of the downtowns, are there any disincentives or ways to discourage developers from developing in downtown flood areas without taking the proper mitigation steps? So those are my two housing questions.
I was wondering if Kari wanted to talk about the percentage.
It's a good question about percentage. We just know that the demand is substantial. And when you have more housing available to meet that demand, you're filling up your schools, you're filling up your stores and your businesses with employees. And so there's some real vitality, economic vitality benefits for housing, let alone just providing for shelter. But I don't have the actual statistics on demand, but the demand I know is important.
Estimates, like, is that going to help with 10% of our total housing need, or we have absolutely no idea?
I think it's a pretty small percentage of the need.
Most of what we've been building is perpetually affordable, but there's not a whole lot you can do in the private sector. And so we've been building condos, we've been, all the V have been changing things for apartments, but we need the private sector to really come in there and work with us in order to build the housing.
So as an example, to try to deal with the homelessness issue and all the money we're spending on the motel program, housing organizations looked at what they would need, and it was something like $120 million a year for 20 years to build enough housing to meet that need for the unsheltered. And that doesn't meet just the need from families to have housing.
And about your question about building well in downtowns. One of the things that we considered in the Flood Safety Act was who was going to be regulating basically flood hazard areas. And as it is, all the most municipalities in Vermont have some kind of flood hazard mitigation regulations, but they're all different. And so one of the things that we considered was, could we, and actually I think this is in there, it does raise the bar to a certain floor for flood hazard area regulations. That should help, it should help in terms of standardizing what are required from people that are building in the downtowns, or in flood hazard areas. But I think there's probably more work to be done there in terms of helping people to build properly in those areas, or discouraging them really from building in those areas. And part of that is with turning over to the state river corridor regulations, because right now most municipalities have no river corridor regulation at all. And so they're meant to address different kinds of hazard, flood hazard areas, or places where they would experience just rising waters like we saw in downtown Montpelier, but river corridor hazards are the kind of erosional damage that we saw in places like Cabot or Marshfield, et cetera. So different places need some different kinds of work. So I think there's still more work to be done there. But yeah, your question is a good one.
Great, thank you. There was a question, the gentleman, and then, oh, okay.
I want to thank you for your time, first of all, and explaining a lot of things. I'm of the opinion that education funding and spending in the state are a crisis, and I want to emphasize that word crisis. And talking about it, I appreciate what you've done, but action needs to be taken. And I was heartened to hear about cost containment, because we can't just keep spending more and trying to raise more money. My question is, well, first, quickly, some perspective. I live in Facein. My husband was on the school board in Facein for 15 years. We were always involved in this. Our kids were educated here. And they went and lived other places and came back here to live, barely being able to afford places. So I have grandchildren in the school systems now, so I'm invested in their education, and it's a value I hold dear. However, I don't know, Facein before Act 60, we were totally self-supporting. We didn't ask the state for a dime. We voted on our own budget. We raised our own revenue. So from my limited perspective, Act 60 created a monster for these towns who are already self-supporting. And yes, we need to provide children in towns who don't have the revenue the Valley does with education. So I see the philosophy behind Act 60. But my question is Act 60 and the subsequent acts, is it sustainable? And is this the most equitable way to fund education in our state? Putting it on the backs of property owners. There's other people who are stakeholders who don't pay property taxes.
Is Act 60 sustainable?
Well, I mean, this is one of the reasons why I'm very interested in turning it into income-based. Once upon a time, we decided that the best way to measure how wealthy someone was based on their property, and now that is just not necessarily accurate. And so, I think it's simpler if we think about it as an income tax, but I also agree with you that that can't be the only shift, and that cost containment is critically important. But that's going to take a different set of solutions. So I think one side of it is how is this equitably hitting people, and the other side is what are we doing about spending. So I think both are worth looking at, but I'm sure other folks have thoughts.
I would say that Act 60 is sustainable, but I would say that the way we have spending and budgeting separate, that's not sustainable. And we have to figure out how we can get those together. So it's not a normal budgeting process where you say how much money do we have, then we're going to spend that. We do it the other way around, where we spend as much money as each district wants. We share it around, like you said. So Facein, if we had a meeting in Stowe, we hear a lot about this, how much money leaves Stowe to help the rest of the state. And the regular taxpayers there have the same question about how much money do some communities have to send out when they don't get a vote on any of those budgets. So I think I agree with the statement earlier that we need to have that cost containment part of it. That's the part that we kind of got, that's not sustainable. That got us into this mess and in this interest of wanting to control how much the money went up. So we said, your taxes are going to be limited to 5%, but you can go up to 10% spending. I don't know why we thought that was going to work. To answer your question, I think the whole overall system is not sustainable, but the the idea that we share the funds, I think is a sustainable idea, but we just don't have the right kind of cost containment. We used to have the excess spending threshold that did help bring that down a little bit, but we got rid of that for a couple different reasons. But I think the pupil weighting study that I was part of that on the study committee, that just came into play. I think we're going to need to tweak that a little bit to make sure that it's equitable for everybody and that it's really meeting the goals that we wanted it to meet. I was 100% agreeing with Senator Watson that we should move to an income-based. I was on the income-based education tax committee, and the problem we ran into is renters. If they're paying on income, are they paying property taxes twice, both from their rent and on their income? And it was such an issue that because we have income sensitivity, I want to say it's almost like 2/3 of people are already paying on income because they're capped. So it was hard to take it beyond that and make it fair to renters is the problem that we ran into. But in general, I agree with the principle.
Okay. Quickly?
No, just same thing.
Okay.
We had a study committee. I was one of the co-chairs. And it sounds simple. We had people on the committee who said, it's just like that. But when you would have to do away with all the income sensitivity, no matter what we did, because of the formulas, we ended up with lower income people or middle income people paying more. We would have to go back and start over. And we could do that. But it will take some time and some extensive number crunching. We can't go back to Warren and, Faiston supporting themselves on their tax base. That wasn't a legislative idea. That was a Supreme Court mandate, constitutional mandate. So every child in the state has to have equal access to educational dollars. And we haven't found anything else to tax that's that can equal property. And if you buy a $500,000 house, then arguably that is a reflection of your wealth. The problem is when you've lived in it for 50 years like I have, I couldn't buy my house at its today's price. We put the income sensitivity in, but there's people that are just over the top. We do need to adjust that formula.
I want to be clear that I supporting other school districts educating their children. I think I tried to convey that, but I want to be clear of it.
Okay. Thank you. We have time for one more question.
It's on the education, you've answered a little bit of it, but you all seem to say how we're going to fund it, how we're going to cut some of the cost of it. Is there any way you can get rid of some of the supervisory districts? We have 14 counties. Why don't we have 14 supervisory districts in the state or something like this? You guys, Vermont Digger said since the year 2000, we've done 38 studies on how to fund this, and we're working on number 39. And I haven't seen any ideas come out of you guys. You need to cut some of the admin staff.
We need, I think, we cannot any longer afford to pay a teacher, I hope at least $50,000 a year, to teach less than 10 kids. And it doesn't seem to be the supervisory unions. We did pretty well getting high schools into large enough groups to be cost effective. But we have an awful lot of very small elementary schools, and they all have principals and they all have overhead. We were looking at this, and I didn't see the email, but I saw the Chair of Ways and Means when she got an email when she was looking at foundation formulas and other things to do. They sent her a very direct and very upsetting email. I don't know what they said, but it's difficult. If we are going to combine and get to 200 kids in an elementary school, never mind the norm of 3, we're going to lose some jobs, or those jobs are going to have to get repurposed. Maybe some principals will have to teach or some assistant
I'm
principals.
not worried about teachers as much as superintendents.
Yeah.
We got a lot of people that I don't think do a lot. I think superintendents can only change the graduation requirements in their district, but why do we have so many managers?
Kari?
Well, we're dipping our toe in looking at greater efficiencies this year. We passed a bill, H 630, which is the BOCES bill, stating for boards of cooperative education services. And this enables the state to stand up to 7. So we have 14 counties. The idea with that, we will now start working across school districts for procurement decisions, so that all that type of contracting, whether it's for services such as speech pathology, or whether it's other types of services, whether it could be such as transportation contracts or procurement of pencils, those types of consolidation of procurement decisions can happen on a much more consolidated basis. We have found that many states have developed this, from New York to Colorado, and they have found a substantial reduction in overall administrative costs of some of the school supplies or services that they're providing. So this is one important step towards looking at how we can do that type of programming or administration in a much more efficient manner. So, good question.
And just one more, Jack. This is coming from a person that doesn't have air conditioning in his house. Did we just spend $60,000 to air condition the State House for one day?
Yeah, I heard it was 70. I read it the day I was there, and I was cold because the air conditioning was too high, and I didn't know about that. I don't know who made that decision. It wasn't us. I don't know if it was the Sergeant of Arms or who made that decision to bring in extra air conditioning for that day. I guess they were worried about the temperature, and we might be there for more than one day. We could have been there for 2 or 3 days, depending on how things go. But I agree with you. I was upset when I read that article. And I agree with you on the superintendents. When I looked into it before, we're over $1 billion in education spending. Even if all of the superintendents got paid zero, it's not going to have a big impact. But I still agree that we should look at more consolidation on the supervisory union level.
Yeah, great suggestions, great questions. Thank you so much. I wish we had another hour to talk, because I know that you probably had other things to do on a Friday night usually, but we really appreciate your being here. Just some closing remarks. As we've heard tonight, the challenges we face are complex and full of nuance. Getting a legislature with at least 3 distinct political parties, a governor from the minority party, to all work together is a Herculean task. However, they must do it to keep our government functioning. But we as citizens must also make ourselves heard. We must be part of the conversation. I sincerely hope that this gathering has been worth your time. I want to extend my heartfelt gratitude to our esteemed legislators for their presence and valuable insights. A special thanks to each one of you in the audience. Your participation enriches our discussions. I encourage you to continue reaching out to our local elected officials. We are privileged to reside in a magnificent state where a citizen legislature fosters direct engagement, blurring the lines between politicians and voters, and uniting us as one cohesive community. Have a wonderful rest of the evening, and feel free to visit with our legislators. Thank you.